The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Seeker cards in the Circle Undone, the 4th Deluxe expansion for the Arkham Horror LCG. As per usual, there are 4 Seeker cards in this deluxe box. However, I am reviewing the cards with the tarot trait separately, so this review will deal with the other 3. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Without further ado, let's get started. The first Seeker card in the box is Fingerprint Kit. It's a 4-cost asset with Intellect skill icon and the item and tool traits. It enters play with 3 supplies and takes up a hand slot. It has the following game text: Action, exhaust Fingerprint Kit and spend 1 supply. Investigate, you get +1 intellect for this investigation. If you succeed, you discover 1 additional clue at your location, and it will take up a hand slot. There are 8 cards with the tool trait, 7 of which are useful while scouring locations for clues. The first card that should immediately come to mind is the good old flashlight from the core set. The 2 resources cheaper than the Fingerprint Kit, Flashlight remains popular because it can reduce the shroud value of a location to 0. And if the shroud value of a location is 0, your investigate action will succeed unless you happen to draw the auto fail or another chaos token that causes you to auto fail. There is a certain comfort that comes along with knowing that success is all but guaranteed, barring some RNG madness, especially if you are playing on hard or expert difficulty. Fingerprint Kit takes the opposite approach, raising an investigator's intellect by 1 rather than lowering the shroud value by 2. Fingerprint Kit may not all but guarantee success at one of those 1 and 2 shroud location, but what it lacks in certainty, it makes up for in tempo, since you get to discover an additional clue if you are successful. There are very few level 0 cards available at the moment that allow an investigator to discover an additional clue, which makes Fingerprint Kit all the more attractive. Besides deduction from the core set, there's a Rite of Seeking, a mystic asset from the Dunwich Legacy, and Winging It, a survivor event from the Depths of Yoth. Discovering an additional clue is amazing whether you're playing solo or multiplayer, although you will have fewer chances to leverage the Fingerprint Kit if you are playing solo, since there are many locations that have only 1 clue per investigator. Fingerprint Kit's tempo boost is fantastic, but I'm not convinced that it's worth paying 4 resources for it, unless you are absolutely certain that you are going to get all of those additional clues. Otherwise, you've just spent 4 resources to boost your intellect by 1 3 times, which doesn't seem like a very good deal to me. The only thing that I'm concerned about is Fingerprint Kit's cost. 4 resources is a significant chunk of change, and I suspect there are some investigators out there who won't be able to afford the Fingerprint Kit and all of their other shiny toys too. Whenever we see a card such as Fingerprint Kit, there is the inevitable comparison to the gold standard in investigation tech, that being Dr. Mylan Christopher. Given the choice between spending 4 resources on Fingerprint Kit or Dr. Mylan Christopher, I think I prefer the good doctor, since he can generate an obscene number of resources during a scenario, which you can spend on other assets, or, later in the campaign, willpower and intellect pumps with higher education. Fingerprint Kit will improve your overall tempo, but it won't help you pass willpower and intellect skill tests like Dr. Mylan Christopher can, which I think is significant. Of course, you can play both Dr. Mylan Christopher and Fingerprint Kit. In that scenario, I'd certainly want to see Dr. Mylan Christopher first, since all of those bonus resources he generates are going to help you pay for the Fingerprint Kit when you do see it in your hand. If you see the Fingerprint Kit first, resources are going to be a lot tighter, and you may struggle to get to Dr. Mylan Christopher down on the table. There are quite a few investigators who may play the Fingerprint Kit. Besides all of the investigators in the Seeker class, there's Carolyn Fern, Roland Banks, Finn Edwards, and Marie Lambeau, as well as all of the Dunwich Legacy investigators, and of course Lola. Fingerprint Kit is fairly pricey, so it lends itself to investigators who can generate extra resources such as Carolyn Fern or Finn Edwards, or those who can play cards at a discount, such as Joe Diamond. I'd also consider playing Fingerprint Kit in Norman Withers. Norman can play the kit for 3 resources if it's on the top of his draw deck. Norman can play Higher Education, so generating a ton of extra resources isn't a pressing concern for him. Fingerprint Kit also happens to be one of the few Seeker cards that Norman can use to discover additional clues. That gives Norman a little more flexibility when it comes to deck construction, since he can play Fingerprint Kit rather than Rite of Seeking, potentially freeing up some of those valuable level 0 Mystic card slots. Fingerprint Kit is a very attractive card that will give an investigator a significant tempo boost. 4 resources is a lot to pay for a card, so you need to make sure you're going to get your money's worth. That means discovering at least 2 clues every time you trigger it. That's a lot easier to do consistently in multiplayer than solo. If you're eyeing Fingerprint Kit, you may also want to consider the level of difficulty of your campaign. If you're playing on hard or expert difficulty, Flashlight is a little bit slower, but it's also a sure thing at those 1 or 2 shroud locations, or as close to a sure thing as you can get with the Chaos Bag. Fingerprint Kit, unfortunately, is not, because it only adds that +1 to your intellect, and there are a lot of negative tokens in that bag, including 6s and 8s. Ultimately, players are going to have to weigh the pros and cons of each of these cards, which I think what makes this game so interesting in the first place. The second Seeker card in the box is Connect the Dots. It's a 4-cost event with 2 intellect skill icons and the insight trait. It has the game text Fast. Play after you discover the last clue at your location. Discover 2 clues at that location with a lower printed shroud value than your location. Holy crap, that is one expensive event. Connect the Dots is quite powerful for a level 0 card in that it lets you potentially discover 3 clues with 1 investigate action. It's somewhat similar to Deciphered Reality, the Seeker event from Lost in Time and Space, although the templating is quite a bit different. Connect the Dots lets you discover a lot of clues. However, much like Interrogate, which I looked at during the review of the Guardian cards, it's been saddled by a bunch of conditions that make it slightly trickier to play. Let's talk about the cost for a moment. The at 4 cost, Connect the Dots is one of the most expensive Seeker events in the game. Only 2 cards that come anywhere close to it are I've Got a Plan from the Miskatonic Museum and Deciphered Reality. And it should be said that Deciphered Reality is a level 5 card. If you're going to play Connect the Dots, you either need a great resource engine, such as Dr. Mylan Christopher, or you need to play it at a discount. Fortunately, Connect the Dots does have the insight trait, so Joe Diamond can stash it in his hunch deck, or play it so he can play it for 2 resources. That's a lot more reasonable, although Joe still needs to draw it from his hunch deck at the right time, which isn't a sure thing, since a card is drawn randomly from the hunch deck at the beginning of each investigation phase. Norman Withers can also play Connect the Dots at a discount if it happens to be on the top card of his deck. 3 resources is still a lot to pay for an event, but Connect the Dots is one of the few Seeker cards that Norman can play to discover multiple clues with 1 action, so beggars can't be choosers. You might be able to get away with playing it in Carolyn Fern or Finn Edwards too, as long as you can keep spitting out those resources. Once you've wrapped your head around Connect the Dots resource cost, you've got to fulfill its other conditions. First, you need to discover the last clue at your location. Depending on whether you're playing multiplayer or solo, fulfilling this condition is more time-consuming than it is difficult. If you're playing in a 4-player game, it's going to take some time to discover all 8 clues at a high shroud location that has 2 clues per investigator. Potentially quite a bit of time if you're unlucky with skill tests, but you'll get there eventually. If you drop Connect the Dots when you snag that last clue, you're going to get a head start on the next location. Once you've discovered the last clue at your location, then you need to fulfill Connect the Dots other condition. There needs to be another location in play that has clues on it and a lower printed shroud value than your location. Again, much like Interrogate, your ability to fulfill these conditions depends a lot on the layout of the scenario and whether you're playing solo or multiplayer. Obviously, Connect the Dots isn't going to do you much good during linear scenarios such as the Essex County Express. It's much better in open-ended scenarios where there are a lot of locations on the board. However, even then, it helps to have a good idea of the location layout ahead of time to get the most out of this card. Let's take a look at the Midnight Masks. If you're playing solo, there are 3, possibly 4 locations in play that have 2 clues on them. Miskatonic University, Northside Graveyard, and potentially Downtown, which is randomly selected. Miskatonic University has the highest shroud value of the bunch at 4, so it makes sense to play Connect the Dots when you discover the last clue at that location. If you make a beeline for Miskatonic University, you could play Connect the Dots targeting Northside or Graveyard. There is a version of Downtown that also has 2 clues per investigator, but you can't target it since it is a 4-shroud location. There's just one problem with this plan. You need to visit either Graveyard or Northside first, then head to Miskatonic University. If you've played the Midnight Masks before, you can probably come up with a route that involves as little backtracking as possible. If it's your first time through, though, playing Connect the Dots at the right time is going to be a lot trickier to pull off. Connect the Dots is much easier to use in multiplayer since more locations will likely be revealed and there will be more clues around to discover. However, you still need the right combination of revealed locations to get the most out of it, unless you race to the highest shroud location on the table first. Let's take another look at the Midnight Masks. Miskatonic University is still your best bet if you want to trigger Connect the Dots, since it's the highest shroud location on the table. If you cleared and then play Connect the Dots, you may target any of the 8 other locations. However, if you clear a 3-shroud location, the number of potential targets for Connect the Dots drops to 5, those being Easttown, Rivertown, Graveyard, St. Mary's Hospital, and your house. If you clear a 2-shroud location, it's not ideal since you will only have 2 potential targets, those being Rivertown and Graveyard. As you can see, playing Connect the Dots effectively depends a lot on the locations you clear and which other locations are on the table and revealed, so it helps to know what your options are in advance. Connect the Dots has the potential to provide you with a significant tempo boost, especially in multiplayer where clues abound. However, it is expensive and it requires a little more forethought and coordination to play than other Seeker cards. It certainly helps if you understand the layout of a scenario ahead of time, but that's not always possible, especially if you prefer to tackle scenarios blind the first time through. I'd certainly consider Connect the Dots for Joe Diamond's Hunch deck, but I'm afraid other investigators will struggle to pay for it unless they can consistently generate a pile of resources, because that 4 resource cost is very, very high for an event. The final Seeker card in the box is Curiosity. It's a skill with willpower and intellect skill icons and the innate trait. It has the game text, while you have 4 or more cards in hand, Curiosity gains 1 willpower and 1 intellect skill icon. While you have 7 or more cards in hand, Curiosity gains 2 willpower and 2 intellect skill icons instead. The Seeker entry in the set of skills with a variable number of icons, Curiosity hasn't received a lot of love since the release of the Circle Undone. If I had to guess, it's probably struggling to gain traction over at Arkham DB because it's more challenging to power up than its counterparts, such as Steadfast and Able-Bodied. If you don't play any cards at the beginning of a scenario, Curiosity has 2 willpower and 2 intellect skill icons. That makes it about as good as either a Guts or a Perception, although Curiosity doesn't replace itself like either of those cards if the skill test is successful. That's a pretty big if, though, considering most players use the first couple of turns of a scenario to set up their board state, dropping a bunch of assets and events on the table. If you play a bunch of cards at the start of the game, Curiosity will likely only have 1 willpower and 1 intellect skill icon until you're able to rebuild your hand, and that's not going to be ideal. Curiosity gains 2 willpower and 2 intellect skill icons if you have 7 or more cards in your hand, but that's a high bar for most investigators to hit, much less maintain with any sort of consistency. I could see Curiosity finding a home in an investigator such as Min-Tae Fan, who likes to keep her hand well stocked so she can commit cards to skill tests performed by other investigators with her signature asset, Analytical Mind. Min decks that want to hoard cards also tend to play Laboratory Assistant to raise their maximum hand size by 2. You've got a little bit more room to maneuver with Curiosity if your maximum hand size is 10 rather than 8, and you're able to keep your hand well stocked. Min's response lets her add a wild skill icon to Curiosity, effectively turning it into a skill with 4 willpower and 4 intellect skill icons. I certainly like the sound of that. It's worth noting that Curiosity has the innate trait, so it can also be played by other investigators who enjoy abusing skills, namely Silas Marsh. Willpower and intellect are Silas's weakest skills, so Curiosity may be worth a look. If Silas commits Curiosity to a skill test, he can always bounce it back to his hand with his response if it turns out that he doesn't need it. Silas's response ensures that those skill icons don't go to waste and his hand remains well stocked, so he can keep above the level he needs to use Curiosity. I'd need to play Silas more to get a sense of the ebb and flow of his deck before I added Curiosity to the mix, though. Curiosity is it's a difficult card to judge because its effectiveness depends on the investigator and your playstyle. While I like the idea of having 3 willpower and 3 intellect skill icons at my disposal, Curiosity is more difficult to turn on than some of the other skills in this box. If you're the type of player who tends to hoard cards in your hand, committing them to skill tests more often than playing them, Curiosity becomes a much more attractive option. I may also consider playing Curiosity in a multiplayer Minte fan build that wants to draw a lot of cards. If I was considering it for another deck, I'd probably play a few test games with it just to determine whether I had a lot of cards in my hand or not. If you're playing or committing cards as fast as you can draw them, Curiosity is probably not the card for you. That's going to do it for my review of the secret cards in the Circle Undone. Fingerprint Kit and Connect the Dots are both attractive because they let investigators discover additional clues, which is still quite a rare ability at level 0. However, both cards make you pay through the nose for the privilege. If you're playing an investigator who can generate a pile of resources or play cards at a discount, Fingerprint Kit and Connect the Dots are worth a look. Otherwise, you may need to reevaluate the cost curve of your deck if you would like to make room for them. Stuffing your deck with all of the powerful, expensive cards is very tempting, but you've still got to pay for them. And 4 resources, in this case, 4 resources is going to be a lot. You should also take into consideration whether you're playing solo or multiplayer, since both cards lend themselves far more to the latter. Curiosity is more difficult to judge since its value at any given moment depends on the number of cards in your hand, which can fluctuate wildly from the beginning of a scenario to the end. Obviously, Curiosity is going to be a lot more valuable to an investigator such as Minte Fan, who tends to hoard cards in her hand, than investigators that aren't packing a lot of draw or tend to play cards as quickly as they draw them. So an interesting set of cards here for the Seekers this time around. Quite expensive, but also potentially quite powerful, especially in multiplayer. I'm looking forward to seeing how much traction they gain in decks going forward. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.